The morning opens on a neighborhood storefront with paper signs about specials and a bell that rings whenever someone enters, and a widowed butcher who has learned to talk about prices so he doesn't have to talk about grief. He leans on memory the way he leans on the counter, steadying himself with numbers and the comfort of familiar customers, until Edith walks in and turns the transaction into conversation. She asks after him as if kindness were a habit you keep sharpening, and he answers with the kind of half-joke people use to signal that the ache is still there, but it won't swallow the day. In their exchange, you hear the thesis of these chapters: ordinary words exchanged in ordinary places can carry extraordinary weight. She buys, he raps, the bell rings again. But the conversation doesn't really end. It migrates from the shop to her living room, where coffee and an old songbook create a bridge he mistakes for an invitation. When he arrives at the house that evening with a rib roast and polka memories, there is genuine warmth in the welcome. Edith's voice, the piano's slightly off-key charm, a chorus of tunes from a younger world, but there is also a boundary that must be kept. His loneliness speaks first. It calls her Liebchen as if language itself could make the leap. Her answer is firm without cruelty. She returns the oversized gesture to its proper shape, lets him go without humiliation, and keeps intact the marriage that makes her generous spirit possible in the first place. The dignity she protects is his and hers at once. From there, the story narrows to two men in a storage room with a locked door and the night for company. The setting is utilitarian shelves, crates a window, painted shut, a register that somehow never balances, but it becomes in the way good comedy can, a pressure chamber for truth. Archie and Michael have been circling each other for years, with formulas, one wielding jokes like a shield and the other carrying arguments like a toolkit. Being trapped removes the audience and the exits, and what remains at first is performance Archie's tall tales about rescue dogs with brandy casks and churchmen who would sign the expense report, Michael's exasperated lectures about logic, fairness, and the questionable ethics of using Noah's Ark as a blueprint for modern life. They get colder, they try a stuck window, they invent plans that collapse as soon as they are spoken. And then, because there is nowhere else to go, they talk about names and who gets to hand them out. Archie insists on a taxonomy of sameness, a tidy arc where everything pairs off with its own kind and nobody questions why. Michael points out the prejudice dressed as tradition, and instead of landing a punchline, he lands on a question. Archie can't dodge. How did you learn to believe that? The answer arrives in a story that sounds like a joke until it doesn't. A father comparing his son's brain to a bird's, a backroom decision about which child gets a future and which child gets a shift that never ends. The insult was delivered decades ago, but the men in the room can still hear it. Michael, who has argued 1,000 points with this man, finds the point that matters: the father was wrong. There is no drum roll and no grand reconciliation. There is only a silence that finally isn't empty, the kind two people share when the door in the conversation actually opens. The narrative then changes altitude from a storeroom's stale air to a mountain town's thin, bright cold, and with it, the subject changes from fathers to marriage. Gloria and Michael have decided that romance might be coaxed back by geography and props an overnight bag, a silky gown that promises a certain mood, a room whose furniture seems to resist choreography. The experiment is earnest and funny and a little heartbreaking. Their talk runs into dead ends made out of timing and the awkwardness of trying to schedule spontaneity. A counting game at the bathroom door turns from cute to ridiculous in 3 seconds. A chair that was supposed to be a throne becomes an obstacle. They bring up basketball of all things because it's easier to talk about stranger streaks than the fear that their own has gone cold. The word divorce appears like a moth in the lamplight, unwanted, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. And then the same mechanism that opened the storeroom door opens this one attention. By saying aloud what they miss, they force themselves to notice what remains. Respect that didn't vanish with the fireworks. Friendship that can survive the dull days. A shared responsibility that changed them into parents and won't let them pretend to be the version of themselves who never had to budget sleep. The comedy keeps them honest. Embarrassment is a solvent for self-importance. When they finally find each other again, it isn't a movie cue so much as a release valve, timed almost to the footsteps of someone who might barge in and turn the moment into farce. They laugh at themselves, and in laughing, remember That desire doesn't die so much as it wanders off and needs to be called back by name. Meanwhile, back in the house where most of these lives are lived, the past walks in as a person and not an argument. Archie's brother Alfred arrives after years long enough to harden into principle. The mood in the room shifts rapidly: delight from Edith, curiosity from Gloria, a kind of skeptical politeness from Michael, while Archie tries not to show that his body has prepared for a fight. His mouth doesn't want to admit is happening. Alfred represents choices. Archie resents different work, different politics, different rules about who gets to sit at the table without a license issued by tradition. He also represents the father they both measured themselves against, and he carries proof in his pockets: a railroad watch that keeps imperfect time and a sealed letter with a due date. The objects are not subtle. One says, time exists, but not the way you thought. The other says, wait before you learn what you think you want to know. Their first conversation is brittle and mean in the way only family fights can be, full of tiny old stories promoted to exhibits in a case that can never be decided. The childish roach derby becomes an indictment. Spilled cola becomes a verdict. Missed moments get rewritten as character flaws. Around them, the rest of the household tries to domesticate the scene with coffee and small talk, because that is how this family rescues people from themselves, by talking about ordinary things until the extraordinary has shrunk to human.
Sighs. It doesn't work at first.
Alfred leaves with the watch in Archie's pocket and the letter unresolved. When they meet again on neutral ground in a bar where familiar labels line up on shelves and men learn how to make bravado look like comfort, the talk improves. Alfred tells the truth about the funeral. He was too drunk to bear it, but not celebrating. Archie lets go a little of the script he's been reading from since childhood and admits that doing everything right didn't buy him the certainty he was promised. The watch serves as a conductor for a current they can name. It adds humor to gravity and keeps them from slipping back into accusation. The letter is a pause button both of them secretly need. If they open it too soon, they risk letting a dead man's phrasing start a whole new war. If they wait, the living might finish the sentence in a better way. By the time they agree on lunch 29 years from tomorrow and then cheat by moving that date closer, the important thing has happened. They have stopped counting who owes what and started quietly to count on each other again. Threaded through these events is a chorus of details that make the neighborhood feel like a character all its own. Songs from an earlier era leak into the present and change the temperature of scenes without asking permission. Old standards carry nostalgia that is both comforting and treacherous, a soundtrack for the idea that the past was simpler because it was yours. Food functions as a language that speaks when mouths can't manage the right words. Pork chops and rib roasts, coffee that keeps getting poured and repoured until someone finally says the thing that needed saying. Work is never far away. Time cards, cash drawers, the practical arithmetic of keeping a household solvent, and with it the politics of who gets to decide what counts as respectable. Archie's fondness for categories and borders is not without reason. He survived by following rules. But rules, as these episodes keep proving, break when they try to contain people instead of protecting them. Archie himself changes in small, detectable ways. The storeroom confession doesn't turn him into a different man. It turns him into the same man with a memory that has finally been taken out of its case and examined in the light. His jokes still come quick. He still deflects tenderness with sarcasm, still policies the world with a reflex that predated his adulthood, still invents these elaborate comic universes where a street Bernard and a Pope solve problems with one bottle and a nod. But there are pauses now, little hesitations, where you can see him editing himself, swapping a cheap laugh for a smaller kindness. He comforts a scared friend even as he mocks the language of fear, and the contradiction doesn't cancel itself out. It reveals that he is learning how to hold both truths at once. Michael notices and quietly plays along, easing off the righteousness when it is not needed, bringing it back when it matters. Edith remains the center of gravity, the one who can make a compliment out of an odd metaphor, and mean it, who can tell a man no without implying that he is less, who can keep a home humming with songs that are sung badly but together. Gloria becomes fluent in a new language of marriage that doesn't require fireworks to prove that the room is warm. The symbolic objects do a lot of narrative work without ever feeling like they were planted just to be decoded. The watch, stubbornly inaccurate, is faithful rather than precise. It demands maintenance. It rewards attention. It is beautiful because it belonged to someone imperfect. The letter is a lesson in delay, teaching everyone involved that sometimes knowing is not the same as healing. You can learn a fact in a second and still need weeks to become the person who can live with it. The butcher's gift that had to be returned becomes, in hindsight, a kind of parable about the difference between generosity and obligation, kindness and consent. Even the motel's wrong chair and the silly counting game at the bathroom door do something important. They show that intimacy is built out of 1,000 minor negotiations, and that losing patience over the wrong chair can be a stand-in for losing patience with yourself. When the maid almost interrupts at the exact wrong moment, the scene flirts with embarrassment on purpose. A good joke here is a safety valve. It lets the pressure out without blowing the whole system. By the time this version reaches its final movement, the household has earned a quieter ending. No one gives a speech that could be quoted at a banquet. No one wins a trial inside the living room where grievances are sometimes staged as if a jury were present. Instead, they do what they always do. They set the table. Someone hums despite not remembering all the words. The adults trade jokes that have been told too many times but somehow sound new when repurposed as reassurance. There is somewhere on a dresser a letter waiting. There is somewhere in a pocket a watch that loses time but still ticks. The butcher changes the sign in his window and tries again. The brothers plan a meal. The couple who thought their story had cooled discover that it has not. It has just shifted into a steadier gear. The man who insisted the world made sense only when divided by species, color, creed, or neighborhood still reaches for labels, but he also reaches slowly, awkwardly, and often by making a joke first for the people standing in front of him. What these chapters preserve better than a slogan or a moral is the sensation that progress in a family is rarely visible in the moment. It shows up later in the way a man doesn't say the cutting thing he would have said last year, or in the way a woman says no without apologizing and then still offers coffee, or in the way a couple's fight ends not with a door slammed, but with a laugh neither of them saw coming. It looks like two men exchanging a broken timepiece and realizing that being off by 30 minutes is not a failure if you keep meeting anyway. It sounds like a song everyone pretends to know sung badly, but together keeping time as best they can. It tastes like too strong coffee and a roast that feeds more people than you meant to invite, because there are always more people to feed than you expected when a house is open the way this house, for all its rules and opinions and habits, remains open. The future is not promised, but the next conversation is, and that is enough to keep the light on the bell on the shop door, working the pencil on the calendar, ready to move an appointment from 29 years from tomorrow to sometime next week when both brothers are free.